Here's something nobody talks about when they teach you how to build wealth. Building it is only half the problem. Because here's what actually happens to most people: they spend 2, 3, sometimes 5 years doing everything right, saving consistently, watching the number grow, making real progress for the first time in their adult life. And then one decision, not even a reckless one, a reasonable one that felt completely manageable at the time, wipes out most of what they built. And they're back at the start again. Not because they're bad with money, not because they made some obviously stupid call, because nobody ever taught them the ratio, the specific relationship between what you have and what you're allowed to take on that separates people who keep building from people who keep starting over. My name is Dave, and I love helping people understand that wealth has two sides, and most financial advice only ever talks about one of them. Today, we're going through the 10 to 1 rule, the protective framework that keeps ordinary people from watching years of progress disappear into a single decision that felt perfectly fine when they made it. Let's start with something called the asymmetry problem, because this is the thing that explains why so many people feel like they're running on a treadmill financially. Building wealth is slow, destroying it is fast. And I don't mean that as a figure of speech. It's a mathematical property of how money actually works. $15,000 saved at $500 a month takes 30 months, 2.5 years of real discipline, real sacrifice, saying no to things consistently over an extended period of time. $15,000 lost takes one signature on one document, 1 month of carrying high interest debt on an unexpected bill, one investment that looked solid and wasn't. The time required to build is measured in years. The time required to destroy is measured in moments. And that asymmetry is the central vulnerability in ordinary wealth building that almost nobody addresses directly. Think about all the financial education out there. Save this percentage. Invest in this account. Let compound interest do the heavy lifting. All of it focused on the building side. The defensive side gets almost no attention. The architecture that protects what you've already built from the decisions that feel reasonable but quietly reset your progress. That's what the 10 to 1 rule is about. And for most people, it's the missing half of everything they were ever taught about money. So here's the rule. Before taking on any new financial liability, your liquid assets should be at least 10 times the size of that liability. Liquid assets, not your net worth, not your home equity, not your retirement account sitting behind an early withdrawal penalty. Cash, money market accounts, and investments you can reach within 48 hours without paying a penalty to do it. And the liability is the total obligation, not the monthly payment, the full amount you're committing to. So if you're thinking about financing a $12,000 car, the 10 to 1 rule says you need $120,000 in liquid assets before that decision is financially sound. Considering $5,000 in credit card debt for a home renovation, you need $50,000 liquid. A $3,000 personal loan, $30,000 liquid. Now I know what's happening right now. You're running those numbers against your actual liquid asset balance and feeling uncomfortable. Good. That discomfort is the point. Because for most ordinary people at most stages of building wealth, those numbers reveal something important: that the liabilities they've been casually taking on are enormous relative to what they actually have accessible. And that gap between what they owe and what they could immediately reach is the precise mechanism that keeps resetting their financial progress. Here's why 10 times specifically: because that question is worth answering properly. The ratio comes from stress testing realistic scenarios, the kind that actually happen to real people. Imagine someone with $20,000 in liquid assets who takes on a $15,000 liability. Their assets are 1.3 times their obligation. They're operating with almost no buffer. Any single additional financial shock, a job disruption, a medical bill, a car repair, forces them to either exit the liability at a loss or take on more debt to cover the gap. One bad month cascades into a financial crisis because the protective cushion was never there. Now take someone with $150,000 in liquid assets taking on that same $15,000 liability. Their ratio is 10 to 1. A job disruption, covered. A medical expense, handled without new debt. A car repair, annoying, not a crisis. The bad month stays a bad month instead of becoming the beginning of a spiral. 10 times is the point where a new liability stops being a threat to your existing position and starts being a tool you can actually use safely. Below that ratio, liabilities are risks. At or above it, they're manageable instruments. That's where the number comes from. Not theory. From running the scenarios that actually derail ordinary people and finding the ratio that consistently survives them. Now, here's where the 10 to 1 rule changes something fundamental about how you think about financial progress. Most people measure progress on one axis: the savings number going up, the net worth growing, the investment account compounding, all of it on a single line moving in one direction. The 10 to 1 rule introduces a second axis: not just how much you have, but what your assets are doing relative to your obligations at any given moment. And here's why that matters. Two people can have identical net worth numbers and completely different vulnerability profiles. Person A has $80,000 in a retirement account, $8,000 in savings, and $45,000 in total liabilities across a car loan, a personal loan, and some credit card debt. Net worth looks okay on paper, but their liquid assets against their total obligations is severely out of balance. They have $8,000 accessible against $45,000 in commitments, one real emergency away from the spiral. Person B has $40,000 in retirement, $35,000 in liquid savings, and $8,000 in liabilities, one manageable car loan. Net worth is actually lower than person A, but they have $35,000 liquid against $8,000 in obligations. They can absorb almost any realistic financial shock without it touching their building trajectory. Person B is significantly more financially stable despite the lower headline number. Because stability isn't just a balance, it's a ratio. And that ratio is what determines whether progress is protected or permanently at risk. Here's where the 10 to 1 rule gets violated most often. And this one's important because the violations almost never feel like violations when they're happening. The most common one is the financed lifestyle upgrade. You get a raise, the new income feels like breathing room. So you finance a better car because the payment fits comfortably. You upgrade your apartment, you put furniture on a payment plan, you book a trip on a credit card. None of these individually feel like a meaningful financial decision, but collectively they represent a significant increase in total liabilities with no corresponding increase in liquid assets. The raise increased your income. It didn't improve your ratio. And every dollar of new liability taken on without 10 corresponding dollars of liquid assets is silently eroding the buffer between you and the reset. The second violation is the opportunity liability, a business idea that needs startup debt, a real estate deal that requires leveraging what you have, a side project funded on credit with the expectation that returns will cover the cost later. These feel different because they're framed as investments. But here's the thing: the 10 to 1 rule doesn't distinguish between a liability taken on for consumption and one taken on for opportunity. Both represent an obligation your liquid assets need to be large enough to absorb if things don't go according to plan. And most opportunity liabilities that destroy ordinary wealth fail that test completely. The person had $15,000 liquid and borrowed $20,000 for an opportunity that didn't perform. Now they have an obligation larger than their entire accessible asset base with nothing left to cover it. The 10 to 1 rule applied before that decision would have said one thing: not yet. Build a $200,000 liquid first. Then the $20,000 opportunity is a managed tool instead of an existential financial risk. Now let's address the obvious objection. Because if you're thinking it, someone else is too. If I need 10 times my liability in liquid assets before I take on any debt, how does anyone ever buy a house? How does anyone finance anything significant? Doesn't this rule make normal adult financial life basically impossible? And look, that's not an unreasonable thing to wonder. So let's address it directly. The 10 to 1 rule is not designed for mortgages. A mortgage is a specific liability category where the underlying asset appreciates over time, where the obligation is spread across 30 years, and where the alternative of renting carries its own financial cost. The arithmetic of a mortgage is genuinely different from consumer debt. What the rule is designed for is every decision in between the major structural milestones: the car financing, the personal loan, the credit card balance carried from month to month, the business debt, The investment opportunity financed on credit. These are the decisions that quietly reset ordinary wealth building over and over again, not the mortgage. The thousands of medium sized financing decisions across an adult financial life that each felt manageable in isolation and collectively kept the liquid asset base permanently too thin to absorb anything unexpected. That's what the rule protects against, not homeownership, the slow bleed of decisions that felt fine one at a time. Here's how to actually use this in practice. Before any financing decision, one question: do my current liquid assets equal at least 10 times what I am about to commit to? Yes. The decision is structurally sound from a protection standpoint. Whether it's a good use of the liability is still a separate question, but the floor is protected. No, the decision isn't appropriate yet, regardless of how manageable the monthly payment looks, regardless of how good the opportunity seems, regardless of how much you want the thing. The monthly payment is not the measure of financial safety. It never was. The ratio between your liquid assets and your total obligations is, and that ratio either clears or it doesn't. What's powerful about this is that it removes the negotiation with yourself that usually happens at the point of a financing decision. You know the feeling. You're talking yourself into it, running scenarios where it works out, telling yourself the payment is fine. The 10-to-1 check cuts that conversation off before it starts. The number either clears or it doesn't. There's nothing to negotiate. 2.5 years of progress wiped out in a month doesn't happen because of bad luck. It happens because the ratio was never right. The assets and the obligations were never in the relationship required to absorb what arrived. The 10-to-1 rule doesn't stop bad things from happening. Life is going to throw curveballs regardless of what your spreadsheet looks like. What it does is make sure that when the curveball arrives, the financial progress you spent years building is still standing on the other side of it. That's the difference between people who keep building and people who keep starting over. Not income, not discipline, not some secret financial knowledge that wealthy people have access to and regular people don't. A ratio. And the habit of checking it before the signature goes down.